Good morning. Please come in. Have as yet. You're all welcome in the courtroom. My name is Judge Caprio. For those of you who have been here before, you know that this is more than just a room with a bench and a gavel. This is a place of understanding. It's a place where we look at the law. Yes, but we never forget to look at the people behind the cases. We listen to stories. We try to find not just a verdict but a path forward. But for that to happen, for justice and compassion to meet, there is one thing that is required from every single person who walks through those doors. The glass in the witness box trembled as the defendant stood immaculate. Jaw clenched, finally crumpled to his knees. He had seconds before been a portrait of arrogance, a billionaire's wife at his side, a smirk that said money would solve anything. Now his face was a raw confession under the courtroom lights. A hush dropped so sudden the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The veteran at the center of this storm looked up from his wheelchair, tears in weathered eyes, and spoke two words that hung like a verdict. Enough, please. Cameras captured every tremor. Phones recorded every whisper. The gallery leaned forward as if the benches themselves might tip the balance. Judge Caprio removed his glasses slowly, folded them, and fixed the courtroom with a look that was not interested in wealth, but in truth. For a moment, time snapped. Arrogance met consequence. Privilege met the human cost. The defendant, who had mocked the court in opening, now faced the one thing money could not bribe: moral exposure. He stood, tried to speak, and only succeeded in making his voice small. The billionaire's wife, previously the portrait of disdain, covered her mouth with the heel of her hand. No costume could hide the fracture. But what happened next shocked the entire courtroom. It was a cold morning that cut through coats and resolve. The marble steps to the courthouse steamed in the breath of gathered people, neighbors, reporters, a handful of veterans with pins on their jackets. The air tasted of metal and coffee and the low hum of outrage. Inside, the courtroom was full. Every spectator seat taken, overflow standing room lining the back. The press gallery was a cluster of lenses and blinking lights, eager for a spectacle. Judge Caprio entered in his robe with the unshowy dignity of someone who views the bench as a place of listening, not display. He set to small papers on the bench, nodded once to the bailiff, and the room inhaled expectation. The defendant arrived in a sleek black suit, flanked by counsel and the billionaire's wife. Pearls, perfect hair, a laugh too bright for the place. The couple exuded a practiced wealth, the quiet confidence of influence, eyes that had learned to make people look away. The victim, in stark contrast, was a retired school bus driver named Thomas Reyes, 72, hands like split rope, back bent from years of labor. He came with his daughter and a small American flag folded in his jacket pocket. His injury was not just a bruise but a wound that cost him the dignity of mobility and the stability of his small life. Brief whispers told the rest. The defendant's car had struck Thomas in a crosswalk. Surveillance blurred by corporate PR initially. Social feeds exploded. The city felt riven, one side defending wealth and character, the other rallying for the old man who had fed kids on his route for decades. People had come to this courtroom not for legal gymnastics but for a communal reckoning. Caprio's eyes scanned the room, the defendant's set jaw, the victim's quiet hands, the public's raw appetite for fairness. The stage was set. Outside, a protest chant rose and fell like a distant wave. Inside, silence waited for the first gavel to break the surface. The footage started with a blink, sunlight slicing across the crosswalk, a stroller's wheel, a flash of a child's sneaker. Thomas had been making his usual morning route across the downtown crosswalk, cane tapping a steady rhythm, head bent with concentration. The defendant's vehicle, an expensive black SUV, came into frame with an aggressive hum, cutting the corner too fast as if the road belonged to it. The impact was a soundless cinema punch. Thomas stumbled, then went down like a winded tree. People screamed. A woman dropped her grocery bag. Apples scattered and rolled like punctuation marks. Eyewitnesses later testified to a scene of chaos that felt disproportionate to the act. A barista on the corner ran out with a towel. A teenager, phone trembling, recorded the whole thing. Surveillance cams from a nearby boutique captured the moment the defendant didn't stop for the injured man on the pavement. Instead, there was a pause and imperceptible heartbeat, and then the car moved on, dust trailing like indifference. Thomas's injuries were agonizing: fractured femur, a concussion, and a body beaten by the fall that took weeks to show the full toll. He was hospitalized on oxygen. Pictures of tubes and bandaged hands circulated overnight. Within hours, social media lit up with outrage. The hashtag Justice for Thomas trended. Late-night commentators dissected privilege. Influencers debated the optics. The city's mayor released a terse statement promising full investigation. Neighborhood groups organized vigils. Coffee shop walls were plastered with flyers demanding accountability. People who had once shrugged at unequal treatment now felt the personal burn. This could have been their father, their grandfather, their neighbor. The city's collective mood shifted from weary tolerance to sharp insistence. This community would not let a life be dismissed. The courtroom became more than a legal arena. It turned into a public forum where the moral ledger sought balancing. And the defendant, insulated by lawyers and wealth, suddenly found himself at the center of a storm whose currency was not money but conscience. The doors opened and the defendant entered like a man who had built his life on doors opening for him. He moved with practiced ease, polished shoes, tailored suit, and aura of entitlement that filled the room. Beside him, the billionaire's wife clicked her heels, chin lifted, a slow smile curving as if the whole affair were an annoying interruption in an otherwise curated life. Their lawyers stepped ahead with measured strides, folders of glossy exhibits and confident lines. The defendant scanned the courtroom and, with a quick, almost contemptuous glance at the gallery, seemed to communicate, "This is beneath me." Then Thomas was wheeled in, smaller than his demeanor. The hospital cardigan hung loosely. The cane lay across his lap. He smiled a tired, forgiving smile at the camera lights and at old neighbors who had come to stand by him. His voice, when he spoke, was low, steady, no grandstanding, only facts. "I crossed the road. I did my job for 40 years, he told a reporter later, eyes on the floor more than on the cameras. His humility pierced the room more than any dramatic outburst could have. Family members clutched his hands. You could see the kind of love that doesn't need spectacle to announce itself. The attorneys danced the familiar choreography, defense polished and rehearsed, asking the judge for procedural grace. Prosecution steady and compassionate, holding up evidence like a shield for the injured. The gallery murmured, some with barely concealed glee at seeing wealth humbled, others with discomfort, uneasy at public humiliation. A circle of veterans stood in the back, caps in hand. The billionaire's wife fanned herself, then watched, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face as her husband's composure started to wobble. Judge Caprio watched these movements with an attentive stillness. His micro-expressions were a study, a slight tightening at Thomas's faltering smile, a lift of the eyebrow at the wife's dismissive posture, an almost imperceptible wobble of disappointment when the defendant made a flippant comment in the hall before the session began. He tapped a pen, folded his hands, and his presence felt like a moral center pulling all these disparate energies into a single orbit. The courtroom vibrated with the anticipation of collision, arrogance meeting quiet dignity, privilege meeting the unvarnished cost of a life appended. The defendant rose with the practiced poise of someone trained to own space. He offered a curt nod to his counsel, then addressed the court with a voice that slid over the room like a velvet curtain, smooth, controlled, entitled. "Not guilty, Your Honor," he said with a dismissive tilt, as if the word itself were a formality to be checked off between private jets and charity galas. The billionaire's wife smiled, the kind of small, sharp smile that had punctured hundreds of uncomfortable silences before. "Accidents happen," the defendant added, tone airy. "We all have bad days. Surely there will be context." The words landed like a gauntlet. A ripple moved through the gallery, a low growl of indignation, a collective remembering of the surveillance footage replayed on every screen. Judge Caprio slowly removed his glasses, folding them with the same deliberate care he applied to weighing human lives. The gesture was tiny but seismic. It told the courtroom, the bench is not inclined to be fooled by polish when lives are torn. "Context," Caprio said softly, leaning forward, eyes narrowing just enough to be kind but firm. "Context does not replace consequence." There was no grandstanding in his voice, only a measured disappointment that cut sharper than any rebuke. The defendant attempted another line, a practiced deflection. "My client is a philanthropist, Your Honor. A life's work," but the courtroom interrupted him, muted murmurs. A cough, the silent stare of the man he had injured. The billionaire's wife, sensing the tide turning, reached to touch his arm in a gesture that meant compose yourself. It read as staged comfort. Caprio's glasses were back on in a beat, but the reality check had been planted. The bench had shifted its weight from mere legality to morality. He would peer not at titles nor at bank statements but at actions and accountability. For a man accustomed to smoothing over consequences with wealth, this moment was the first real mirror. And for the rest of the courtroom, the pledge of not guilty had become the spark for a moral trial far beyond procedural claims, a test of character in public view. The lights dimmed and the screen grew large, the grainy footage of that morning filling the courtroom like a confession. Every click of the projector felt like a gavel. The camera angle captured the crosswalk from the boutique's window, Thomas stepping into frame with measured care, the stroller rolling past an oblivious happiness. The defendant's SUV sliced into view, tires whispering against the pavement. The vehicle's speed read as impatience, not an accident but a decision. The SUV clipped the curb, a small but telling maneuver, then struck Thomas with a force that sent his body folding like a broken hinge. Close-up zoomed in, the defendant's foot easing off the brake, then crucially not stopping. The rolling of the wheel, a pause, then the SUV pulling away, with the kind of haste that spoke of avoidance more than shock. The bench watched in silence as the lens caught the defendant glancing backward at the scene, not to render aid but to check for witnesses. The billionaire's face on the screen, younger, less controlled, flickered with an expression the gallery had not yet seen, a flicker of calculated self-preservation. As the footage looped, the defendant's mask began to crack. His jaw tightened. A sheen of sweat appeared. His voice, when he tried to speak, lost its earlier polish. His lawyer stepped to the podium, offering explanations about visibility, momentary lapses, mitigating factors. But the footage was unsparing. The prosecution played a slowed frame of the moment Thomas hit the pavement, and the sound in the courtroom was only the collective intake of breath. A small, stunned thing. Gasps threaded through the gallery. The billionaire's wife turned pale, though she kept her composure. People in the overflow began to whisper, then to weep, some quietly, some openly. The veterans shifted, their silence heavy. Even the cameras seemed to fumble for angles that could contain the moral weight of what they were seeing. The defendant's facade and armor of money and influence bounced under the spotlight and showed fractures. What had been an argument over negligence was now a public story about avoidance, about a failure to honor the most basic human duty: stop, help, be humane. The footage did what legal briefs could not. It made viewers into witnesses. The courtroom had been handed a mirror, and what it reflected would not be easily polished away. When Thomas rose slowly, with the help of his daughter, the room leaned forward as if proximity could make his words clearer. He approached the microphone, cane tapping the floor in a rhythm that had shepherded children across streets for decades. His voice was gravel and rainwater, steady and unadorned. "I grew up in this neighborhood," he began, not a plea but a history. "I drove the yellow bus for 40 years. I knew every kid by name." The gallery felt the weight of years in each syllable. He told the story not of the accident, but of mornings lined with small acts of care, holding a hand while a child learned to tie a shoe, pulling a coat close on winter days, the quiet promise of showing up. "The work we do isn't flashy," he said. "It's quiet. We keep people safe." He glanced at the defendant, not with ire, but with a piercing sorrow that made anger unnecessary. "I don't want vengeance. I want recognition. I want the truth to be met with responsibility." His humility made the defendant's earlier arrogance look grotesque. The billionaire's wife shifted in her seat, a tiny, involuntary shiver. The courtroom's lights seemed to warm the lines on Thomas's face, the lines of laughter and weather and grit. A neighbor spoke up from the gallery, short testimony about Thomas helping his son when he had nowhere else to turn. Stories like breadcrumb trails led to the real men beneath the headlines, and each breadcrumb deepened public empathy. Thomas's daughter handed the court a small folded envelope, a stack of letters from families he had helped across decades. The prosecutor read them aloud. Notes of thanks, pictures from school plays, a child's shaky drawing of a bus complete with smiling driver. The contrast between the veteran's lifetime of tiny, honorable choices and the defendant's single, self-interested act carved the moral geography of the case. There was no rhetoric in Thomas's voice, only an honest ledger of service. The courtroom's emotional temperature shifted. Sympathy swelled into moral clarity. For a brief stretch, the cameras captured not the drama of accusation, but the dignity of ordinary life. That human reveal made the stakes plain. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about recognizing worth. The judge, the family, and the city listened as if being taught a lesson they had always known, but had forgotten in the glare of wealth. Judge Caprio paused, the court hanging on a breath. He looked toward the entrance and asked, in that calm that draws confessions like light draws shadows, "Miss Hartwell, would you please come forward?" The billionaire's wife, Marianne Hartwell, stood as if compelled, her posture tight, a practiced mask hardening around her mouth. She walked the aisle with the soft clack of expensive heels, the gallery watching each step as though it were part of a trial itself. Once before the bench, she hesitated. Then she unfolded a story that staggered the room. In a voice that began brittle and then fell into honest breakage, Marianne recounted private moments, how her husband had once come home from meetings and complained about the inconveniences of ordinary life, how their world taught them to prioritize reputation over repair. She spoke about a late-night call when the defendant had confessed, not guilt but fear that stopping would mean headlines and lawsuits, fear of impact on their image more than on a life. "We raised him to be unyielding," she said, voice cracking. "We taught him that inconvenience is other people's problem." The courtroom listened as Marianne's monologue became an unveiling of privilege passed down like heirlooms. She admitted to urging distance, to calls made to friends asking questions about witnesses and lawyers. She spoke of denial, how the family tried to handle things quietly, to remove messes without acknowledgement. Then, with a steadiness that surprised even the judge, she turned to Thomas and said, "I'm sorry for what my silence cost you, for the message my life taught him." The apology landed with the force of a reckoning. The defendant, who until now had guarded his composure, began to unravel. His hands trembled. His defenses fell away as he watched his wife, his ally in projection, reveal the truth that his lawyers had tried to obscure. Tears, not the polished tears of a rehearsed PR moment, but the ragged, honest kind, streaked his face. He tried to speak, but his voice broke on the name of a man he had once passed without seeing. The public accountability Marianne offered reframed the case. It was no longer merely an individual lapse but a household failing, a culture of avoidance confessing in public. The veterans in the gallery watched as an emblem of power admitted culpability for the environment that enabled harm. Marianne's monologue was an unexpected pivot from denial to responsibility. The courtroom felt like a family dining room where long-hidden truths had been set on the table. For the first time, the defendant was forced to confront not only his choices, but the moral architecture that raised him. The moment was fierce, intimate, and devastatingly human. Judge Caprio rose, not to grandstand, but to steady the room. His voice, when it came, was the kind that puts a hand on the shoulder of a community and says, "We will heal, but we must first see. We have heard videos, seen footage, and read statements," he began, palms resting lightly on the bench. "But what the court must also consider is what this city teaches its young. Are we shaping citizens who see the humanity in others, or citizens who see inconvenience as an obstacle to a curated life?" He spoke about character in clear, simple sentences. The true test of a person's character is not how they act when praised, but how they act in moments of disruption. Do you stop and help, or do you sidestep the human cost? He turned briefly to Thomas and nodded with a softness that acknowledged service. Then he faced the defendant directly. Privilege can be a tool for good, or it can be a shield for selfishness. The law does not measure net worth. It measures actions and their effects. Judge Caprio wove in stories short, human vignettes of people who use small power to protect instead of to protect themselves. He emphasized teaching and redemption. Our justice should not only punish, it should educate. It should correct the course, not merely make an example. But his warmth carried steel. Accountability cannot be bought off or obscured by a polished apology. Genuine apology is shown through change, not PR teams. He quoted a line that felt both personal and communal. Character reveals itself in chaos. The courtroom repeated the idea in a hum. He called for humility, asked the defendant to imagine himself in Thomas's shoes, to feel the small grinding indignities of loss. When we put others above our schedule, our image, our convenience, we become the people worth admiring, Caprio said. His words landed like a compass, pointing not only to punishment but to a path forward. The speech balanced moral gravity with the possibility of transformation. It was stern yet forgiving, a plea for societal introspection wrapped around a charge to act. When Caprio sat, the room held a kind of quiet that wasn't defeat but the hush of a community preparing to mend. His final line before sentencing read like an invitation and an ultimatum. Make reparations sincere. Let your next act show us the person you claim to be. Sentencing transformational justice must include four components: legal punishment, jail, probation, fines; community service, specifically helping the group they harmed, counseling, education, anger, MGMT, etc. Public apology, video plus letter plus courtroom read. Judge Caprio's gavel came down with a sound that balanced consequence and possibility. For the harm done and the breach of civic duty, he declared, this court sentences the defendant to 6 months of incarceration, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. The gallery reacted, a wash of approval, a few inhales of relief. The legal punishment was not merely punitive but purposeful. Enough time to reflect, enough oversight to ensure change. Next, the judge outlined community service targeted directly to healing what had been broken. You will spend 400 hours working with the senior aid program you helped harm the Crosswalk Safety Initiative and the City Veterans Outreach, Caprio ordered. The defendant's eyes widened. The billionaire's wife pressed her fingers together in barely contained distress. The service was specific, assisting with transportation for elderly citizens, facilitating safety workshops, and participating in neighborhood outreach efforts. It was designed so the defendant would see, up close and repeated, the dignity of those he had overlooked. Third came counseling and education. Enrollment in an intensive educational program is required, Caprio said. You will attend community empathy training, anger management, and restorative justice workshops at your own expense. Certificates of completion would be presented to the court. This element made change practical skills to rebuild character, not just rhetoric. Finally, Judge Caprio mandated a public apology process that could not be managed by PR templates. You will produce a recorded public apology video and a written letter to Mr. Reyes and the community, both to be delivered and read aloud in this courtroom on the date of your release from custody. The apology must include a personal recounting of actions taken to make amends and a pledge detailing steps for future conduct. The court required transparency. The video and letter would be posted on the city's public justice portal and remain accessible for 2 years. The sentence balanced accountability and rehabilitation. It refused to let wealth insulate responsibility while offering a path to genuine restitution. It demanded proximity to damaged lives, daily acts of service and learning so that the defendant would be forced to translate remorse into repeated, observable change. The courtroom felt the gravity of a justice that aimed not to humiliate, but to redeem through specific, restorative measures. 6 months later, the defendant walked out of a small county facility different than the man who had entered. He moved with quiet purpose rather than practiced posture. The stint behind bars had been brief by many standards but intense. He had worked mornings on the Crosswalk Safety Program, spent afternoons at the Veterans Outreach Center, and attended weekly restorative justice circles. He arrived at the Veterans Center on a gray Tuesday with a box of donated coats and a readiness to be useful. Thomas met him at the door, tentative at first, then with a steady nod. The reconciliation was not cinematic in the way tabloids imagine. It was awkward. Human work apologies said aloud. Explained actions like lists of proof, documented community hours, certificates from anger management, and a personal letter read aloud in front of the outreach group. I can't undo what happened, the defendant said, voice raw, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. Thomas, with the weight of someone who had seen both cruelty and kindness, accepted the apology and agreed to volunteer together on a neighborhood safety initiative. Their handshake was not true, just hands closing on the possibility of repair. At home, Marianne's confessions led to therapy and a public campaign she started for civic responsibility among the wealthy, an initiative that forced peers to confront how privilege shapes action. The couple's relationship, once propped by performative gestures, began to shift toward accountability and shared service. It was not a fairy tale restoration but a slow reconfiguration of values. Judge Caprio received updates from the court's restorative board. The defendant fulfilled his obligations and continued with counseling. The final hearing involved a short reflection from the judge who spoke of the case as a lesson for the community. Justice healed here not because we humiliated the wealthy, but because we expected them to learn and to serve. Cameras captured a small scene of community volunteers, veterans, neighbors, and the once defendant painting crosswalks and teaching children pedestrian safety. The closing image was of Thomas and the defendant standing side by side under newly painted stripes, sunlight soft on concrete. Judge Caprio's final words echoed as a voiceover in the court's public release. Let accountability be our habit and compassion our habits work. The story ended not with vengeance but with mutual responsibility. If this moved you, honor our elders and veterans, stand up for justice and compassion. Subscribe for more real stories of accountability plus compassion.